The world existed in shades of white and gray on the morning of December 2nd, 1941, when Oberleutnant Klaus Steiner pressed frozen binoculars against his face and saw the prize that had cost so much blood. Through the crystalline air, beyond the skeletal birch forests and across the frozen Moskva River, the golden domes of the Kremlin caught the weak winter sun like distant flames. 28 years old, a teacher of literature from München in what felt like another lifetime, Steiner had marched through Poland in weeks, watched Paris fall in days, and now stood 15 kilometers from the heart of the Soviet Union, with victory so close he could taste the metallic promise of it in the freezing air. His breath emerged in thick clouds that crystallized instantly, tiny ice particles drifting down to join the endless white expanse stretching in every direction. The wind carried the distant rumble of artillery, that familiar thunder that had become the soundtrack of his existence since June. Somewhere behind him, spread across a front 600 kilometers wide, 3 million men waited in positions that should have been their jumping-off point for the final assault. Army Group Center, the spearhead of Operation Barbarossa, the greatest invasion force ever assembled. 7,000 artillery pieces, 3,350 tanks, 1,500 aircraft, numbers that had crushed every obstacle from the Bug River to the gates of Moscow in 5 months of uninterrupted victory. The radio crackled with static and frost, the operator's voice distorted but unmistakably triumphant. All units, Army Group Center. Final preparations for assault on Moscow commence at dawn, December 3rd. The Führer expects total victory within 1 week. Heil Hitler! Steiner lowered the binoculars and in that moment of inattention, reached with his bare hand to adjust the rifle slung across his shoulder. The metal of the barrel might as well have been a brand pulled from a forge, except it burned with cold rather than heat. His palm adhered instantly, skin cells flashed freezing to the steel. He jerked back instinctively and felt the skin tear away, leaving a patch of raw flesh that began bleeding immediately. The blood froze before it could drip, forming dark crystals on his palm. The pain came seconds later, sharp and deep. But what struck him more forcefully was the omen of it, the casual violence of this land that could wound a man without enemy action, without malice, simply by existing. He wrapped the hand in a rag torn from a dead Russian shirt and looked back toward the distant columns of his division. They stretched to the horizon like some vast iron serpent, coiled and ready to strike. Except the serpent had begun to move with the lethargy of a creature succumbing to winter torpor. The Panzer IIIs and IVs that should have been roaring forward sat silent in their positions, crews huddled inside trying to preserve body heat and mechanical function simultaneously. The Opel Blitz trucks that had carried supplies from Brest-Litovsk to the outskirts of Moscow now stood like monuments to ambition, their engines frozen solid, oil turned to black sludge in their crankcases. Even the horses, 500,000 of them spread across Army Group Center, stood with heads lowered against the wind, ribs showing through winter coats that evolution had prepared for Russian winters, but not for the demands of total war. The temperature had reached -20°C 3 days ago. The meteorological reports promised it would continue to drop. Steiner had fought through the summer in the same light uniform he wore now, a cotton tunic designed for the temperate campaigns of Western Europe, boots whose soles were already separating from the uppers, gloves so thin he could feel every contour of his rifle through them. When the cold had first arrived in late October, it had seemed manageable, even refreshing after the mud and rain. Now it felt like the land itself had become hostile, as if Russia were a living entity that had merely tolerated their presence until the moment came to show them what real cold meant. He descended from the observation point and made his way back to the company command post, a commandeered farmhouse that still smelled of the peasants who had fled or been killed when the Wehrmacht arrived. Inside, officers clustered around a map spread on a table that wobbled on uneven legs, their faces illuminated by the dim glow of oil lamps that cast dancing shadows on walls marked with old water stains and newer bullet holes. Major Werner Hoffmann, the battalion commander, looked up with eyes that had developed the permanent squint of a man staring too long at frozen landscapes. "Steiner, your assessment of the approach routes?" The question hung in the air with the smoke from a dozen cigarettes. Steiner peeled off his gloves, wincing as the fabric stuck briefly to his damaged palm. 15 kilometers to the Kremlin as the crow flies. But crows don't march through snow. The roads are sheets of ice over frozen mud. Vehicles will struggle. Infantry can advance but slowly. The river crossings are frozen solid, which helps, but also exposes us on the ice. Hoffman traced a finger along the map, following the planned assault routes. His hand trembled slightly, though whether from cold or something deeper, Steiner couldn't say. Berlin expects us to be in Red Square by December 10th, 6 days from tomorrow. The statement drew only silence. Someone coughed, the sound wet and labored. The kind of cough that had become epidemic as respiratory infections spread through troops without adequate protection from the elements. Finally, Hauptmann Ernst Keller, who commanded the reconnaissance company, spoke up. "With respect, Herr Major, we can barely move our vehicles. Half the men report frostbite symptoms. Supply convoys are days behind schedule. Perhaps a delay until we can consolidate." The Major's fist came down on the table hard enough to make the lamps jump. "There will be no delay. The Führer has ordered the assault, and we will carry it out. Germany does not retreat, and Germany does not wait. We adapt, we overcome, and we conquer. Those are our only options." The certainty in his voice belonged to a world that no longer existed, if it ever had. Steiner saw it in the other officers' faces. That flicker of doubt quickly suppressed. The trained response of men who had learned that questioning orders brought consequences worse than enemy fire. He had seen 3 officers court-martialed since October for the crime of stating obvious truths about their deteriorating situation. 2 had been shot. The 3rd had been sent back to the front with a demotion and the kind of black mark that meant he would be assigned every suicide mission until probability caught up with him. The meeting dissolved into discussions of ammunition distribution and artillery support, the mechanics of war that continued regardless of whether the war itself still made sense. Steiner slipped out into the brutal cold, pulling his inadequate collar up against a wind that laughed at such feeble gestures. Snow had begun falling, not the gentle flakes of a German winter, but hard particles of ice that stung exposed skin like tiny projectiles. 3 days earlier, when the temperature had been merely unpleasant rather than lethal, the division had attempted what the High Command called creative adaptation to local conditions. Unteroffizier Hans Becker, a 35-year-old veteran from Hamburg who had survived the Western Front in the previous war, had gathered his squad and demonstrated the techniques that would save them. They stuffed newspapers and Soviet propaganda leaflets inside their uniforms for insulation. They burned furniture and fence posts from abandoned villages to create fires that provided momentary relief. They kept vehicle engines running continuously to prevent the catastrophic freezing that would render them immobile. For 72 hours, these measures had worked well enough to maintain the illusion of control. Then on November 20th, the temperature had plummeted from -20 to -35 Celsius in the span of 48 hours, as if nature had decided the preliminary skirmish was over and real combat could begin. The newspaper insulation that had seemed so clever became soaked with sweat from physical exertion, then froze solid against the skin, creating ice shells inside their uniforms that drew heat from their bodies faster than bare cloth. The continuous running of engines depleted fuel reserves that were supposed to last weeks in a matter of days, leaving hundreds of vehicles immobilized not from mechanical failure, but from empty tanks, stranded like beached ships on an ocean of white. The fires they had burned through every scrap of combustible material within marching distance, leaving subsequent positions without even the possibility of warmth. Becker found Steiner as he made his rounds through the positions, checking on men who increasingly resembled casualties more than combat soldiers. The Unteroffizier's face had aged a decade in the past month, deep lines carved around his eyes and mouth, frost clinging to the stubble on his chin where his breath had frozen. "Herr Oberleutnant, permission to speak freely?" Steiner glanced around at the nearby soldiers, most of them hunched in improvised shelters or standing watch with the glazed eyes of the deeply exhausted. "Granted. The men are asking about winter equipment, coats, proper boots. The Russians have them. Why don't we?" The question carried no challenge, only the bewilderment of a soldier trying to understand why his leaders would send him into winter without winter clothing. Steiner had asked himself the same question 1,000 times and arrived at only one conclusion, though he would never speak it aloud. We weren't supposed to need them. The war was supposed to be over by now. Moscow was supposed to fall in October. Becker absorbed this with the stoicism of a man who had learned not to expect logic from circumstances beyond his control. Well, it's December, and we're still here, and the cold isn't going away. Lost 3 men last night. They just didn't wake up, froze in their sleep despite being next to each other for warmth. I'll mention it to battalion command. They'll mention it to division, who'll mention it to army group, who'll mention it to Berlin, and Berlin will tell us to have faith in the Führer's genius. Meanwhile, we freeze. The bitterness in his voice was new, or perhaps just newly spoken aloud. Steiner wanted to argue, to provide some reassurance that higher authority understood their situation and was working to remedy it, but the lie stuck in his throat. Instead, he clasped the Unteroffizier's shoulder briefly, a gesture that meant nothing and everything simultaneously. Keep them alive, Hans. Just keep them alive. That's all we're doing anymore, isn't it? Not fighting, just trying not to die. 2 kilometers to the south, the mechanical death that would define the campaign had already begun its inexorable work. 2nd Panzer Army, commanded by General Heinz Guderian, had started the offensive on June 22nd with 900 operational tanks, the steel fist that had smashed through Soviet defenses from Brest to Bryansk. By November 1st, after 5 months of combat and minimal maintenance, 400 remained functional. By November 25th, when the temperature dropped below -30, that number had collapsed to 200. By December 1st, 98 tanks were still capable of movement. The causes of death were diverse but predictable. The Maybach engines that powered the Panzers had been designed for Central European operations, not Siberian cold. Their oil, a careful German formulation optimized for efficiency, turned to syrupy sludge at -20 and solidified completely at -30. Crews attempting to start frozen engines heard the starters grind uselessly, watched smoke pour from compartments as desperate measures to heat. The oil resulted in fires, felt the sickening crack of metal components shattering under stresses they were never designed to withstand. Transmissions seized, radiators burst, fuel lines froze and ruptured. Track links became so brittle they snapped under normal operation, leaving tanks immobilized in positions they could neither advance from nor retreat from. The 4th Army, holding the center of the assault line 30 kilometers west of Moscow, lost 350 trucks in a single night when the temperature dropped to -38. Drivers who had parked their vehicles after exhausting runs through the frozen landscape tried to start them at dawn and found only silence. The batteries, already weakened by months of use, had frozen solid. The engines refused even to turn over. Mechanics moved from vehicle to vehicle with blowtorches, attempting to warm the engines enough to coax them to life. But for everyone they saved, 3 more succumbed to the catastrophic damage caused by ice expanding in their cooling systems. The Luftwaffe, which had dominated Soviet skies through the summer and autumn, found 60% of its aircraft grounded. Engines that had performed flawlessly at -10 refused to start at -30. Hydraulic fluid thickened to the consistency of molasses. Gun oil froze solid, rendering weapons useless. De-icing equipment designed for European winters proved laughably inadequate for Russian conditions. Pilots who managed to get airborne found their controls sluggish, their visibility reduced by frost forming on canopies faster than heating systems could clear it, their mission effectiveness reduced to a fraction of summer capability. The infantry weapons suffered their own specialized deaths. The Karabiner 98 Kine rifles, the standard arm of the Wehrmacht, had functioned without complaint through campaigns in Poland, France, and the Balkans. In the Russian winter, their firing pins froze mid-cycle, requiring soldiers to urinate on the mechanisms to warm them enough to function. A degrading solution that corroded the metal and reduced reliability even further. The MG-34 machine guns, precision instruments that represented the pinnacle of German engineering, jammed when oil in their recoil mechanism turned to paste. Soldiers learned not to touch metal with bare skin after dozens of cases of flesh adhering to weapons, leaving bloody patches when torn away. Some wrapped their rifles in rags. Others wore gloves too thick to fit fingers through trigger guards. All of them felt the creeping certainty that their equipment, like their bodies, was slowly being defeated by an enemy that required no ammunition and suffered no casualties. The radios died next. Those vital links that connected battalion to regiment to division to corps to army group to high command. The batteries that powered the field radios were designed for temperate conditions and began failing at -20. By -30, 70% were non-functional. Field telephones required lines strung through frozen territory where Soviet partisans cut them as fast as German signals troops could repair them. Messengers on motorcycles found their vehicles as vulnerable to cold as any other machine. Communication, that invisible web that transformed a mob into an army, began fragmenting into isolated units acting on hours-old information or no information at all. In Rastenburg, East Prussia, 800 kilometers from the freezing soldiers around Moscow, Adolf Hitler stood in his headquarters surrounded by maps that showed divisions and corps as tidy symbols, clean lines of advance, objectives marked with confident circles. The physical reality of frostbite and frozen engines did not penetrate these walls. The carefully filtered reports that reached him emphasized determination and minimized disaster. When General Guderian sent a telegram on November 25th requesting winter equipment and warning of catastrophic vehicle losses, Hitler read it aloud to his assembled staff with barely concealed contempt. Guderian requests permission to withdraw to winter positions. He claims his army cannot continue offensive operations in current conditions. The words hung in the air of the overheated room. Hitler's eyes, when he looked up from the message, contained a certainty that had ossified into doctrine. Moscow will fall before Christmas. This is not a prediction. This is an order. The cold affects the Bolsheviks as much as it affects us. Their will is breaking. Ours must remain firm. General Franz Halder, chief of the General Staff, a professional soldier who had spent his career studying the mechanics of warfare, cleared his throat carefully. Mein Führer, the reports indicate significant equipment failures due to temperature. Perhaps if we consolidated our positions for the winter and resumed operations in spring. The suggestion died under Hitler's glare. Napoleon failed because he was weak, because his soldiers were weak. The German soldier is the finest fighting man in history. A little cold will not defeat him. To even suggest withdrawal is defeatist thinking. Halder persisted, knowing the cost of silence. The soldiers lack winter clothing. Perhaps if we expedited production and distribution. Hitler's hand slammed down on the map hard enough to make the markers jump. Winter clothing? You want to tell our soldiers that we expect them to still be fighting in winter? That we doubt the offensive will succeed? Such measures would destroy morale. The army will take Moscow with the equipment it has. There will be no winter. There will only be victory. The meeting continued, but its conclusion had been determined before it began. No winter equipment would be produced. No strategic withdrawal would be authorized. The offensive would continue because to admit it could not continue would be to admit fallibility, and the regime's entire foundation rested on the premise of infallibility. Orders went out to Army Group commanders. Maintain pressure, prepare for final assault, accept no talk of defensive positions or temporary withdrawal. The distance between Hitler's certainty and the reality his soldiers inhabited had become unbridgeable. Yet both sides continued as if their incompatible visions could somehow coexist. On the Minsk-Moscow highway, a supply convoy of 120 trucks departed its staging area on November 28th, carrying food, ammunition, and fuel to forward positions. The journey should have taken 18 hours. The convoy commander, a logistics major who had spent the previous war managing railheads behind the Western Front, understood that winter campaigns required meticulous planning and robust supply chains. What he had not understood, what no amount of studying could have prepared him for, was that in Russia, the infrastructure itself became the enemy. The dirt roads that had been navigable in summer and challenging in autumn had transformed into something between solid ground and liquid nightmare. The autumn rains had turned them to soup. The first frost had frozen that soup into a landscape of ridges and crevasses, 2 meters deep in places, petrified waves of mud that destroyed suspensions and axles. The subsequent snows had covered this terrain with a deceptive blanket that concealed the hazards beneath. Trucks broke through the snow crust and high-centered on frozen mud ridges. their wheels spinning uselessly. Others slid into the deep ruts and overturned, spilling their cargo and sometimes their drivers into the white wasteland. The first truck lost occurred at kilometer marker 43, when the lead vehicle's driver misjudged a turn obscured by blowing snow and plunged through ice into a frozen stream bed. The water underneath was not deep, perhaps a meter, but it was flowing and liquid beneath its icy crust. The driver, a 22-year-old conscript from Dresden, had time to scream once as the cab filled with water whose temperature sat just above freezing. His companions tried to help, throwing ropes, but the ropes froze rigid in the air and became useless. They watched him for 15 minutes as he pounded on the windshield, mouth open in screams they could hear even through the glass and water, until the cold stopped his heart or his lungs filled with liquid or hypothermia shut down his brain. When they finally chipped through the ice to reach him, his body was frozen in the driver's seat, eyes still open, hands still gripping the steering wheel, a blue statue of terror. The convoy continued because stopping meant death for everyone. They left the truck in the stream, marked the location for theoretical recovery that would never happen, and pressed on into the white hell. By kilometer 80, they had lost 37 vehicles to breakdowns, accidents, and fuel exhaustion. By kilometer 115, only 23 trucks remained. They arrived at their destination 3 days late, carrying less than 20% of the supplies they had departed with. The mathematics of logistics became the mathematics of starvation. Army Group Center required 750 tons of supplies per day to maintain offensive operations. The Luftwaffe, flying in conditions that grounded half its fleet, could deliver 100 tons daily. The rail lines ended 200 kilometers behind the front, leaving a gap that horse-drawn wagons and the shrinking truck fleet could not bridge. The horses died by the thousands. Army Group Center had brought 500,000 horses into Russia, those patient beasts that had carried supplies and pulled artillery since the days of Frederick the Great. They were not the sleek cavalry mounts of propaganda imagery, but working animals, draft horses and farm horses requisitioned from across occupied Europe. They had been adequate for summer operations, struggling but functional through autumn mud, and they died in wholesale lots when winter arrived. Cold-blooded animals enter torpor when temperatures drop. Warm-blooded animals increase metabolic activity to maintain body temperature, which requires additional calories. The horses received no additional rations. Their normal feed of hay and grain had been calculated for European operations, not for minus 30 Celsius. They began losing weight rapidly, ribs showing through winter coats, muscles wasting as their bodies consumed themselves for fuel. When they collapsed in harness, as 2,000 to 3,000 did daily by early December, soldiers faced a choice. They could shoot the animal and render it for meat, violating regulations against destroying military property. They could leave it to freeze, which happened faster than seemed possible, or they could try to get it moving again through beating or encouragement, efforts that succeeded perhaps 1 time in 10. The soldiers ate the horses. Officers looked away as their men carved meat from carcasses still warm from life. Regulations about proper butchering procedures and meat inspection abandoned in the face of starvation. The flesh was tough, stringy, barely edible even when cooked, which most of it was not. Men ate it raw, frozen in chunks that had to be broken with combat knives, chewing mechanically while trying not to think about the animals they had worked beside for months. Some wept while eating. Others vomited it back up, their systems rebelling against the barbarism. All of them knew they were consuming their own logistics network, that each horse eaten was one less to haul supplies forward, but hunger overrode strategy. Feldwebel Otto Meissner, whose weathered face and steady hands marked him as a survivor of previous impossible situations, found himself leading a burial detail on the morning of December 1st. 3 men from his company had failed to wake when roused for the pre-dawn stand-to. They had gone to sleep in a cluster, sharing body heat, wrapped in everything they possessed. Sometime during the night, while the temperature dropped to minus 37 and the wind howled through gaps in the farmhouse walls they were sheltering in, their metabolisms had lost the battle to keep their core temperatures above the threshold for consciousness. They had frozen to death in their sleep. Meissner stood looking down at them, these boys young enough to be his sons, their faces peaceful in death in a way they had never been in life. One still had his arms around another, that final gesture of shared warmth now permanent. The ground was frozen too solid to dig graves. The standard procedure was to stack the bodies like cordwood beside the road for eventual recovery by graves registration units that were themselves stranded somewhere behind them. He refused to do it, could not do it, despite knowing his refusal was pointless sentiment. "We'll cover them with snow," he told his squad, and saw his own pain reflected in their faces. "At least they'll rest clean." They built a cairn of packed snow over the bodies, a temporary monument that would last until the spring thaw exposed the grimmer reality. Meissner had fought on the Western Front from 1916 to 1918, had seen men die in every way the human body could fail, and he took out the small diary he kept hidden from inspections and wrote by the dim light of a nearly exhausted candle. December 1st, lost 3 men last night to the cold. No enemy action. No heroism. They simply froze. We eat horse meat when we can find it, tastes like copper and exhaustion. The young ones cry when they eat, though they try to hide it. They still have enough softness to be horrified. I remember Verdun, when we ate rats and called ourselves lucky. This is worse. At Verdun, we knew what we were fighting for, even if it made no sense. Here, we're just dying slowly and pretending it's for victory. He closed the diary and returned it to the inner pocket where it stayed warm against his chest. One of the few things that did. The pre-dawn light was beginning to gray the eastern horizon, that reluctant sunrise that came late and left early in December. Soon the order would come to move forward another few hundred meters toward Moscow, another day of pushing exhausted bodies through exhausted landscapes. The medical situation had progressed from serious to catastrophic by the first week of December. At a field hospital established in a requisition schoolhouse near Klin, 30 kilometers northwest of Moscow, Hauptmann Dr. Friedrich Wolf worked 18-hour shifts treating conditions he had only read about in medical texts. Frostbite arrived in waves, dozens of cases daily by late November, hundreds by early December. The progression was predictable but no less horrifying for its predictability. First came the numbness, soldiers reporting they could no longer feel their toes or fingers. In the early stages, aggressive warming could save the tissue. But in an environment where aggressive warming meant holding frozen appendages near a fire for 30 minutes, where such fires were rare and time rarer still, early intervention was theoretical rather than practical. The numbness progressed to pain as circulation stuttered back to life, then to a mottled purple as capillaries collapsed, then to the waxy white of tissue death. The necrotic flesh turned black within hours, gangrene spreading faster in the cold than any textbook had prepared him for. Amputation became routine. Wolf performed 20 to 30 amputations daily, working by the light of oil lamps because the generator fuel had been diverted to more critical uses. The procedure was simple in concept. Remove the dead tissue before infection killed the host. The reality involved sawing through frozen flesh and bone without adequate anesthesia because the morphine had frozen solid in its ampules, and attempts to warm it had resulted in explosions. Men bit down on leather straps, or sticks, or their own arms. Some screamed, some fainted, some simply stared at the ceiling with the glazed eyes of those who had detached from a reality too painful to inhabit. A 19-year-old private from Cologne, whose name Wolf did not record because he could not bear to remember them all, watched as the doctor sawed through both feet at mid-ankle. The tissue was so frozen it cut cleanly, almost like wood, until the saw reached bone and began that distinctive grinding that set teeth on edge. The boy's eyes stayed locked on Wolf's face through the entire procedure. And when it was done, when his feet lay on the floor like discarded boots, his first words came out in a whisper. "Will I still be able to march?" Wolf had no answer. The boy would live, probably, if infection did not set in. He would be shipped back to Germany on a hospital train. He would spend the rest of his life on prosthetics or in a wheelchair. He would never march again. But Wolf could not force those words past the tightness in his throat, so he simply patted the boy's shoulder and moved on to the next patient, and the next after that. The casualty statistics told a story that higher command refused to read. Army Group Center reported 14,000 killed in action between December 1st and 3rd, 23,000 wounded, and 52,000 frostbite cases. The cold was killing and maiming more effectively than the Red Army. The Ninth Army, holding positions northwest of Moscow, reported 60% of its strength as combat ineffective from cold-related injuries alone. 4th Panzer Group counted its remaining operational strength. 800 of its original 1,400 tanks still functioned, and half of those were considered unreliable. In the Kremlin, in a bunker complex that had been expanded and reinforced as German forces drew closer, Joseph Stalin received reports of his own casualties with the emotional detachment that had characterized his entire reign. The Western Front, defending the direct approaches to Moscow, had lost 350,000 men in November. The number was unsustainable by any rational calculation. Yet Stalin's response to his chief of staff contained no hint of concern. And the fascist losses? General Alexander Vasilevsky, standing at attention in the presence of a man who had liquidated thousands of officers in the purges of 1937, consulted his notes with hands that trembled slightly. Intelligence estimates 100,000 German casualties from cold-related causes in November, Comrade Stalin. Combat casualties are difficult to assess, but believed to be significant. Stalin lit his pipe, the tobacco smoke adding another layer to the already thick atmosphere of the underground command post. At 63, his face had settled into lines of suspicion and calculation, pockmarked skin and a mustache stained yellow from nicotine. He studied the map on the wall showing German positions as red arrows pointing at Moscow like accusing fingers. Then winter is doing its job. How much longer can they sustain this offensive? Marshal Georgy Zhukov, newly arrived from Leningrad to command Moscow's defense, stepped forward. At 45, he was young for his rank, a peasant's son who had risen through competence and a willingness to accept casualties that would have broken other commanders. His face carried the permanent tension of a man balancing on the edge of a knife, knowing that success meant survival and failure meant a bullet. 2 weeks, Comrade Stalin, perhaps 3 at most. Their supply lines are collapsing. Equipment losses exceed their replacement capacity. The soldiers are exhausted and freezing. If we can hold for 2 more weeks, they will be forced to halt. Stalin removed the pipe from his mouth and used the stem to point at the map. And then we attack. I have been accumulating reserves. 58 divisions held back from the front. Siberian reinforcements arriving from the Far East. 15 divisions trained and equipped for winter warfare. Intelligence from Comrade Sorge in Tokyo confirms Japan will not attack in the east. We can strip those forces without risk. The implications settled over the room like the snow settling over the frozen armies outside. Stalin's smile, when it came, contained no warmth. How many tanks? 1,500 operational by mid-December. 3,000 aircraft. The factories in the Urals are producing faster than the fascists can destroy our equipment. Stalin nodded slowly, calculations running behind those cold eyes. Order all forces, not one step back. Every meter of ground they take costs them blood and time. Let winter soften them, then we crush them. The order, not one step back, would echo through Soviet lines with the force of law, which it was. Retreat without authorization meant court-martial and execution. To flee meant death from NKVD barrier troops stationed behind the lines with orders to shoot anyone who ran. The brutality of the policy was intentional, a recognition that desperation and terror could accomplish what morale and training could not. The Soviet Union would hold because the alternative to holding was death, and death on the front lines at least came with the possibility of taking enemies with you. The women and old men of Moscow dug trenches through frozen earth, using pickaxes to break the surface before shovels could bite. The anti-tank ditches that ring the city stretched for hundreds of kilometers, 4 meters deep and 5 meters wide, positioned to funnel German armor into kill zones. The work proceeded around the clock, illuminated by bonfires at night, punctuated by Luftwaffe raids that killed workers and cratered their excavations. They filled the craters and continued digging. Children as young as 12 carried messages between Red Army units, crawling through snow with notes tucked in their coats, risking capture and execution to maintain communications. In the factories, workers operated presses and lathes in 16-hour shifts, sleeping on cots beside their stations. The rhythm of industrial production, their lullaby and wake-up call. Tank production hit 25 T-34s daily, despite bombing that regularly killed workers and destroyed equipment. Ammunition plants turned out 2 million rounds per day. The Soviet war machine, battered and bleeding, continued functioning through sheer force of will and the understanding that surrender meant extinction. By December 3rd, when the German offensive that was supposed to have taken Moscow by December 10th finally lurched forward, it did so with all the momentum of a wounded animal dragging itself towards shelter. The infantry advanced through snow that was waist-deep in places, each step requiring conscious effort, muscles screaming protest as they pushed through the frozen landscape. Men collapsed from exhaustion after moving a few hundred meters. Officers screamed orders that received sluggish compliance. The gap between command and execution widening as bodies approached their physiological limits. The remaining tanks moved at walking pace or slower, conserving fuel and mechanical function, their crews knowing that once they stopped, restarting the engines might prove impossible. The Luftwaffe flew sorties when weather permitted, which was rarely. Visibility dropped to near zero during snowstorms. Cloud ceilings came down to treetop level. The few planes that did get airborne faced Soviet fighters flown by pilots who understood winter flying, whose ground crews had winterized their aircraft, who fought with the desperation of defending the last city that stood between the invaders and total victory. The supply crisis had moved beyond critical into catastrophic. Frontline units went days without rations. Soldiers boiled leather from belts and boots, chewing the resultant mass for whatever nutritional value it might contain, which was approximately zero. Tree bark was stripped and consumed, causing dysentery that spread through companies already weakened by cold and hunger. Fights broke out over frozen horse carcasses, men who had trained together and fought together turning on each other with the savage simplicity of starving animals. Some officers distributed their own rations to their men, others hoarded what they had. The breakdown of social cohesion, that invisible force that transformed individuals into military units, accelerated as basic survival overrode discipline and loyalty. Gefreiter Paul Schmidt, 17 years old, though his papers claim 19, sat in a ruined barn on December 4th and tried to write a letter to his mother. The pencil kept freezing. The paper cracked when he pressed too hard. His hands shook from cold and hunger and the accumulated terror of weeks spent waiting to die. He had lied about his age to enlist, swept up in the fervor of June when victory seemed assured and glory beckoned. Now he wanted nothing more than to be home in his bed, under quilts his grandmother had sewn, eating his mother's potato soup, listening to his father read the newspaper aloud. The letter began well enough. "Dear Mama." Then the words failed him because what could he write that would not terrify her or invite censorship from the Feldpost inspectors? He could not tell her that he dreamed about food more than he dreamed about girls, that he had eaten his wool scarf in his sleep last night, waking to find himself chewing the frozen fibers, his stomach cramping around the indigestible mass, that half his company was dead or evacuated, and the other half was dying incrementally, that he was afraid, always afraid, not of the Russians but of the cold and the hunger and the slowly dawning certainty that he would never see Germany again. Instead, he wrote, "I am well and hope you are the same. We are close to Moscow now. The weather is cold, but we manage. Please send food if you can. Anything. I miss your soup. I miss home. Please send anything." He folded the letter and tucked it inside his tunic where body heat might keep it from freezing completely. The Feldpost was running irregularly at best, and he had no way of knowing if any mail was getting through. But the ritual of writing provided a connection to a world where people were warm and fed and alive. He leaned back against a beam and closed his eyes, and within seconds was asleep despite the cold, his body shutting down functions to conserve the energy it no longer had. On December 4th, a German patrol captured a Soviet soldier near Khimki, 8 kilometers from the Kremlin. The prisoner was young, perhaps 20, dressed in a white snowsuit that had kept him invisible until he stepped into the open to surrender. The interrogation took place in a basement that still smelled of cabbage from its previous occupants. The German intelligence officer, a university professor in civilian life, conducted the interview in Russian he had learned specifically for this deployment. The prisoner gave name, rank, and serial number as Geneva Convention required. Then, unprompted, he volunteered information that transformed the interrogation from routine to urgent. What division? 32nd Siberian Rifle Division. The interrogator paused, checking his intelligence summaries. The 32nd Siberian had last been reported in Vladivostok, 8,000 kilometers to the east. When did you arrive? 4 days ago. Traveled by train through Urals. Many divisions coming. They told us fascists were freezing. We just had to wait for them to die. The interrogator pressed for details. How many divisions? What equipment? What was morale like? The prisoner answered with the mix of patriotism and pragmatism of a soldier who knew he was beaten but not defeated. When the interrogation ended, the prisoner was led away to a POW cage, and the interrogator hurried to find his commanding officer with news that should have come from aerial reconnaissance or signals intelligence, but had instead arrived from the mouth of a captured private. The implications rippled up the command chain. Wehrmacht intelligence had estimated Soviet reserves at perhaps 20 divisions, battered units pulled from quieter sectors. The reality emerging from multiple interrogations and reconnaissance reports suggested the number was closer to 60 divisions, many of them fresh from Siberia, equipped with winter gear and trained for the exact conditions that were destroying German combat effectiveness. The German assumption that the Soviet Union was on the verge of collapse, that one more push would break them, proved catastrophically wrong. The realization came too slowly to matter. Confirmation required cross-checking multiple sources. Analysis required time that events did not allow. By the time the intelligence summaries reached the commanders who might have acted on them, the Soviet counteroffensive was 36 hours from launching. The window for German withdrawal, already narrow, had closed. On December 5th, a patrol from 3rd Company, 268th Infantry Division, received orders to relieve a guard post near Khimki that had gone silent on the radio. They trudged through snow that came up to their thighs, moving in the half-light of dawn, their breath steaming in clouds that froze before dissipating. The post should have been manned by 8 soldiers covering a strategic crossroads. They found the men at their positions, rifles in hand, eyes open, completely frozen. The squad leader, an Obergefreiter from Stuttgart, approached the nearest sentry slowly, some superstitious dread making him reluctant to get close. The soldier stood upright, rifle at ready position, his face turned toward the east as if watching for an enemy that had never come or had come so silently he never saw it. Frost covered his eyebrows and eyelashes. His lips were parted slightly. Frozen breath hanging in a cloud of ice crystals in front of his mouth. He looked peaceful, as if he had simply paused in thought and might resume movement at any moment. The Obergefreiter reached out and touched the man's shoulder. The body was rigid, frozen solid, cold radiating from it like from a block of ice. All 8 men were the same, standing or kneeling at their posts, weapons ready, eyes open, dead from cold so severe it had killed them where they stood without giving them time to call for help or even to fall down. One man in the squad vomited into the snow. Another made the sign of the cross despite years of Nazi indoctrination against religious sentiment. The Obergefreiter, whose name was Heinrich Baumann, and who had been a shop teacher before the war, stared at the frozen sentries and felt something break inside him. Some last connection to the certainty that had brought him this far. Get back to command. Tell them what we found. Tell them we need to retreat. Tell them now. The runner took off at a stumbling run through the snow. Baumann stayed with the frozen men, unable to leave them, unable to understand how war had brought him to this place where soldiers died standing up, and the enemy wasn't other soldiers, but the air itself. He would survive the war, returning to Germany in 1947 after years in Soviet captivity, and he would never speak of what he had seen, except once, in 1963, when a student asked him what the war had been like. He would describe the frozen soldiers, their eyes still open, watching eternally for an enemy that needed no weapons. Then he would excuse himself and not return to class for 3 days. The report reached battalion command by mid-morning. The colonel, a career officer named Dietrich, who had fought in Poland and France with distinction, read the message 3 times before accepting its content as factual rather than psychological breakdown. Get me Berlin. We need authorization to withdraw immediately. His chief of staff, who had been with him since France, nodded agreement. The men cannot hold in these conditions. We've lost more soldiers to cold than combat. If we don't pull back, we lose the army. Get me Berlin. The radio connection took 2 hours to establish through multiple relay stations. When the link finally crackled to life, the response came not from Berlin but from Army Group Center headquarters. Withdrawal is forbidden. Hold all positions. The Führer has ordered fanatical resistance. Any commander who retreats without direct authorization from the Führer himself will face court-martial and execution. Acknowledge. Colonel Dietrich acknowledged. He had no choice. The alternative was a bullet. He disconnected and looked at his staff, seeing his own despair reflected in their faces. We hold. For how long? Until we're relieved or we freeze to death. Whichever comes first. 24 hours later at 05:30 on December 6th, the Soviet counteroffensive began with an artillery barrage that transformed the frozen landscape into hell. The darkness before dawn on December 5th belonged to men who had made peace with winter. In forests, 20 kilometers behind Soviet lines, the 32nd Siberian Rifle Division assembled in silence that spoke of professional competence rather than fear. These soldiers had grown up in Vladivostok and Khabarovsk, in Irkutsk and Chita, places where January temperatures made Moscow's current -38 seem almost mild. They wore white camouflage suits over quilted jackets lined with cotton batting, felt boots called Valenki that kept feet warm to -50, Ushanka hats with ear flaps tied under chins. Their PPS-41 submachine guns had been cleaned with diesel fuel that wouldn't freeze, test-fired to ensure the 71-round drums would feed properly. They carried 3 days of rations, including lard that provided calories dense enough to fuel bodies working in extreme cold, and a vodka ration that would be consumed not for courage, but for the temporary warmth it provided before hypothermia made alcohol consumption suicidal. Lieutenant Dmitry Volkov moved among his platoon checking equipment with the thoroughness of a man who understood that small oversights meant death at these temperatures. 23 years old, son of a factory foreman from Novosibirsk, he had spent his entire military career in eastern postings and knew winter the way desert dwellers know sand. He stopped beside a private whose ski bindings looked loose. Tighten those. You'll lose a ski in the first kilometer. The soldier complied immediately, fingers working efficiently despite wearing gloves. Volkov noted the competence with satisfaction. These men were not the desperate conscripts who had died in waves during the summer retreats. They were trained soldiers who had spent October and November drilling in conditions worse than what they would face today. They knew how to move silently through snow. They knew how to identify frostbite symptoms before tissue death occurred. They knew that survival in Russian winter required treating the cold as a neutral force to be managed rather than an enemy to be fought. Behind them, the T-34 tanks sat with engines idling quietly, diesel motors that started reliably in conditions that had murdered German gasoline engines. The tanks' wide tracks distributed weight across snow that would bog down narrower German treads. Their sloped armor deflected shells at angles German engineers had not anticipated. They represented not just military hardware, but industrial capacity. The factories in the Urals that had been relocated piece by piece ahead of the German advance and were now producing 25 tanks daily, while Panzer production struggled to replace losses. Marshal Georgy Zhukov stood in the underground command post that had been carved into a hillside and reinforced with timbers that still smelled of fresh-cut pine. Maps covered every wall, marked with red arrows showing German positions and blue arrows showing planned axes of advance. He had arrived from Leningrad 3 weeks earlier, with a reputation for accepting massive casualties in exchange for tactical success, a trait that made Stalin trust him where other generals inspired only suspicion. At 45, his face carried the permanent tension of command, jaw muscles that never quite relaxed, eyes that cataloged threats and opportunities with equal intensity. His staff officers clustered around the main map table, where the plan for the counteroffensive had been refined through dozens of iterations. Colonel Mikhail Sokolov, chief of operations, traced the primary thrust lines with a pencil whose point had been sharpened so many times it was barely an inch long. First wave attacks at 05:30 with artillery preparation. Kalinin front strikes toward Klin from the north. Western front hits the center at Istra. Southwestern front applies pressure in the south. Total strength first wave, 88,000 men, 1,500 artillery pieces, 300 tanks. Zhukov studied the map with the intensity of a man whose failure would result in execution rather than mere demotion. The German positions showed on the map as a jagged line pressing toward Moscow, salients jutting forward where successful attacks had gained ground, gaps where exhaustion or casualties had created weak points. Intelligence reports suggested German combat effectiveness had declined to perhaps 30% of summer levels. The question was whether 30% of the Wehrmacht remained more dangerous than 100% of the Red Army. Reserve deployment? Second wave, 58 divisions held back for exploitation once breakthrough achieved. Siberian divisions positioned for pursuit operations. Total strategic reserve, 220,000 men. The numbers represented the Soviet Union's terrible arithmetic. The country could lose 300,000 men in a month, as it had in November, and still field armies capable of offensive operations because the population base and industrial capacity, however battered, exceeded Germany's ability to inflict attrition. The Stavka had calculated that trading Soviet lives for time would eventually exhaust German offensive capability. The calculation had proven correct, though the price had been paid in blood and frozen corpses across a front 2,000 kilometers long. Zhukov checked his watch. 0445. In 45 minutes, the largest Soviet offensive since the German invasion began would commence. He turned to his political officer, a NKVD colonel, whose presence ensured ideological reliability. Communications to all front commanders. Execute as planned. No unauthorized withdrawals. Units that fail to achieve objectives will answer to the Stavka. The political officer nodded and moved to the radio room. Zhukov returned his attention to the map, calculating distances and timings, weighing probabilities and contingencies. Every commander knew the penalty for failure. Every commander also knew that successful defense of Moscow meant survival not just militarily, but personally. Stalin had made clear that defeatism would be punished with the same finality as enemy action. The artillery preparation began precisely on schedule at 0530, with a sound that transformed the frozen landscape into something beyond human comprehension. 1,500 guns from 70 60mm field pieces to 100 mm howitzers opened fire simultaneously across a front 60 kilometers wide. The sound was not individual explosions, but a continuous roar that overwhelmed the capacity of human hearing to distinguish separate events. The earth shook. Snow cascaded from trees. Men on both sides felt the concussion in their chests, that physical punch of overpressure that made ribs vibrate and hearts skip beats. The German positions absorbed this fury with the helplessness of men caught in a natural disaster. Shells arrived in sheets of fire and steel, churning frozen earth into smoking craters, collapsing dugouts, obliterating trenches. The carefully constructed defensive works that had seemed permanent hours earlier ceased to exist. Men who had survived 5 months of combat died in the first 30 seconds, bodies torn apart by high explosives or buried alive when their shelters caved in. Others survived the initial barrage and crouched in whatever cover remained, hands over ears that bled from ruptured eardrums, mouths open to equalize pressure, minds blank with terror. Oberleutnant Klaus Steiner woke from exhausted sleep to apocalypse. The farmhouse that had been his command post shuddered with each impact, chunks of plaster falling from the ceiling, the oil lamp swinging wildly on its hook. He rolled out of the corner where he had been sleeping and crawled toward the door, knowing that staying inside a building during artillery bombardment invited death from structural collapse. Outside was worse. The sky had turned orange and black, continuous flashes of explosions backlit by burning vehicles and buildings. The sound made thought impossible. He saw shapes moving in the chaos, but couldn't identify them as friend or enemy, or simply men running from oblivion. The Katyusha rockets arrived 30 minutes into the barrage, a different kind of horror. The launcher trucks, positioned 5 kilometers behind the front line, elevated their rails and fired salvos that crossed the sky in arcs of fire. Each BM-13 launcher carried 16 rockets. 200 launchers meant 3,200 rockets in approximately 30 seconds. The sound of their flight was a shriek that rose above even the artillery, and their impact created a maelstrom of blast waves and shrapnel that swept away everything in a 200-meter radius. German soldiers who had never experienced Katyusha fire lost control of bodily functions, their minds unable to process destruction on this scale. Veterans who had faced them before simply tried to get underground and stay there until the storm passed. When the barrage lifted at 06:00, the silence felt unnatural, oppressive. Steiner's ears rang with tones that would never fully disappear. He pulled himself upright and tried to assess the situation. His company had been spread across a 2-kilometer front in positions that no longer existed. Radio communication was impossible, the battery frozen and probably destroyed anyway. He began moving toward where the first platoon should have been and found only craters and debris. Bodies lay scattered like discarded dolls, some intact but most torn apart by the sustained violence. A sergeant he recognized only by the insignia on his shoulder sat against a shattered tree trunk, alive but in shock, eyes seeing nothing. "Can you walk?" The sergeant didn't respond. Steiner shook him, getting no reaction, and moved on. Gathering scattered men into some semblance of organization consumed the next 15 minutes, time that felt simultaneously compressed and eternal. He collected 37 soldiers from a company that had numbered 180 the previous evening. More might be alive somewhere in the chaos, but finding them would require time he didn't have because the next phase of the Soviet attack had begun. They came out of the blizzard like ghosts given form. Soviet ski troops in white camouflage moved with fluid efficiency, teams of 6 or 8 advancing in bounds, suppressing positions with automatic weapons fire, while other teams flanked and destroyed. The Germans tried to respond, but their frozen rifles jammed after a few shots. Those who managed to fire found their targets simply dropped into the snow and disappeared, making it impossible to tell if they had scored hits or if the Soviets were using cover. The engagement lasted perhaps 5 minutes before Steiner realized his remaining force had been reduced to 20 men, and continuing to hold this position meant annihilation. "Fall back! Pull back to the secondary line!" He had no idea if a secondary line still existed, but movement felt necessary to prevent complete paralysis. They retreated in disorder, stumbling through snow, leaving wounded behind because carrying them meant death for everyone. Behind them, Soviet infantry consolidated the position and moved forward without pausing, the momentum of their advance never slowing. The counteroffensive that German intelligence had deemed impossible had achieved surprise so complete that resistance collapsed before it could organize. 15 kilometers to the north, near the town of Klin, the false encirclement that would become one of the offensive's defining deceptions unfolded with elegant simplicity. A Soviet ski company, 120 men, moved southwest of the town, making no effort at stealth. They fired flares at irregular intervals. They left clear tracks in the snow. They used radios they knew the Germans could intercept to call for reinforcements that weren't coming. The deception's goal was to convince the German defenders that a major force was attempting to cut them off from retreat routes to the west. Colonel Ernst Richter, commanding the defense of Klin with elements of the Ninth Army, received reports of Soviet movement to his southwest and made the logical assumption that proved fatal. The Soviets were attempting encirclement. His force of 20,000 men, already weakened by cold and supply shortages, could not withstand being cut off from the main German positions. The tactical manual solution was clear: withdraw before the encirclement closed. He issued orders at Lions on December 6th for a phased retreat to positions 15 kilometers west. The movement would be conducted in good order, with rear guards holding while the main body displaced. In theory, it was textbook defensive operations. In reality, it opened a gap in the German line that Soviet commanders exploited within hours. The main Soviet thrust, 3 divisions strong, had been aimed at a different sector entirely. When they encountered the gap left by Richter's withdrawal, they poured through it like water through a broken dam. By nightfall on December 6th, 20,000 German soldiers found themselves isolated north of the gap, supply lines cut, communication with higher headquarters lost. They had withdrawn from one position to avoid encirclement and succeeded only in creating the encirclement they had feared. Soviet forces moved behind them, establishing blocking positions while other units continued the advance westward. The men who had expected to reach safety discovered they had traded one trap for another, this one even more complete. The psychological impact radiated through German units faster than radio reports. If an entire division could be cut off by a feint, if the Soviets had enough forces to execute deceptions while simultaneously launching major attacks, then the intelligence assessments about Soviet weakness were catastrophically wrong. Officers who had been planning final assaults on Moscow found themselves planning defensive withdrawals. Soldiers who had believed themselves part of an unstoppable advance began to understand they were part of a retreating army that had lost the initiative. Night brought no respite, only a different category of terror. Soviet doctrine emphasized night attacks during the winter offensive, a calculated decision based on multiple factors. Darkness hid the attackers until the final moments. German night vision equipment, already inadequate, functioned even worse in extreme cold. The psychological strain of defending against invisible enemies accelerated the collapse of unit cohesion. Most importantly, the cold that affected both sides equally became a weapon that killed defenders who couldn't move, while attackers generated body heat through action. The German positions around Istra, 20 kilometers west of Moscow, experienced the night hunters in their full horror. Soviet assault teams moved through the darkness using terrain they had scouted during daylight, approaching German trenches from unexpected angles, timing their attacks for the hours between midnight and dawn, when exhaustion and cold had reduced alertness to its lowest ebb. They moved without sound through fresh snow, white camouflage rendering them invisible until they were within grenade range. The first indication of attack came not from observation, but from explosions. RGD-33 grenades arced into trenches, their blasts amplified by the confined spaces, killing or wounding men who never saw their attackers. The survivors tried to return fire, but shooting at muzzle flashes in darkness meant hitting nothing while revealing their own positions. The Soviets used this predictable response against them, firing tracer rounds high to create false targets, while actual assault teams approached from different directions entirely. Gefreiter Paul Schmidt, the 17-year-old who had written the letter to his mother, was on sentry duty when the night attack hit his position. He stood in a trench that had been cut through frozen earth at great effort, wrapped in every piece of cloth he possessed. Clutching his rifle with hands he could no longer feel. The attack came as sound first, grenades detonating 50 meters to his left, then movement in the darkness that might have been wind-blown snow but probably wasn't. He raised his rifle and tried to fire. The bolt wouldn't close. He worked it frantically, fingers clumsy in gloves, and finally got it to function. He aimed at shadows and pulled the trigger. Nothing happened. The firing pin had frozen mid-travel. He tried to work the bolt again and it jammed completely. He was holding an 8-pound club in the shape of a rifle. He opened his mouth to shout a warning and felt hot breath on the back of his neck. Someone behind him. How had someone gotten behind him? He tried to turn, but the knife entered his throat at an angle that severed the carotid artery and windpipe simultaneously. The wound was efficiently lethal, but death took almost a minute, enough time for him to feel his life spilling out in hot spurts that froze before hitting the ground. Enough time to think about his mother's potato soup one last time. Enough time for everything to fade into white silence. The Soviet soldier who killed him was a Siberian sergeant named Alexei Volkov. No relation to Lieutenant Dmitry Volkov, though they came from the same region. He cleaned his knife in the snow, a gesture of professional maintenance rather than psychological need. He had killed 11 men since the offensive began and would kill 7 more before taking a German bullet through the chest on December 18th. He felt neither satisfaction nor remorse about his actions. He was a soldier performing a soldier's function in a war that had killed his father and brother and burned his village. The Germans had brought this to Russia. Russia was returning it with interest. The pattern repeated across the front through the night. Soviet teams appeared from darkness, struck with sudden violence, disappeared before effective response could develop. German positions that had seemed secure at sunset were overrun by midnight. Units that tried to retreat in darkness became disoriented, wandered into minefields or Soviet ambushes, or simply froze to death after losing their way. The few German officers who maintained control found their orders ignored as survival instinct overrode discipline. Men refused sentry duty, preferring court-martial to the certainty of death in the darkness. Others abandoned their positions entirely, fleeing westward through snow in the desperate hope of reaching safety that retreated before them like a mirage. The Luftwaffe made no appearance. Cloud cover sat at 200 meters with visibility below 500 meters horizontally. Night flying in those conditions meant suicide. German pilots sat in ready rooms, heated by wood stoves, listening to radio reports of the disaster unfolding, unable to intervene. The vaunted air superiority that had characterized the summer campaign had evaporated with the cold weather, leaving ground forces to face Soviet attacks without the support that had been as fundamental to German tactics as artillery or armor. By dawn on December 7th, the German front had not bent. It had broken. Soviet forces had advanced between 10 and 25 kilometers on a front 60 kilometers wide. German casualties for the first 36 hours exceeded 40,000, with entire battalions simply ceasing to exist. More catastrophically, the coherent defensive line that had existed on December 5th no longer existed on December 7th. German units had been pushed back in some sectors, surrounded in others, and disintegrated completely in a few cases. The maps at Army Group Center headquarters showed red symbols in positions those units had occupied days earlier, but the symbols represented wishful thinking rather than combat effectiveness. In Moscow, the sound of artillery had been constant for 3 days, the rumble of the battle reaching the city as distant thunder. On December 6th, the anniversary of the Soviet Constitution, Stalin emerged from the Kremlin to address a crowd gathered in Red Square despite temperatures below -30. His advisors had argued against it. German artillery could reach the city center. A single lucky shell could decapitate Soviet leadership. Stalin dismissed their concerns with the contempt he reserved for those who prioritize personal safety over symbolic gesture. He climbed to the podium bundled in his greatcoat, the winter cold affecting even him, though he showed no sign of it. 10,000 Muscovites stood in formation, their presence mandatory but their attention genuine. These were people who had spent 3 months wondering if they would wake to German occupation, who had dug trenches and built tank traps, and worked factory shifts that lasted until collapse. They deserved to hear from their leader, even if their leader was a monster who had liquidated millions of his own citizens for ideological purity. His speech was not recorded verbatim, but accounts from those present captured its essence. Stalin did not promise easy victory. He acknowledged the enemy's strength, the gravity of the situation, the losses already suffered. Then he turned the narrative toward history, toward precedent, toward the recurring pattern of invaders who had discovered that Russia could not be conquered by those who underestimated its people and its land. Napoleon reached Moscow with the greatest army Europe had assembled. Where is his empire now? In the dustbin of history. Hitler believes he can succeed where Napoleon failed. He will learn the same lesson. Russia is not conquered from without. It is defended from within, by our soldiers who fight with courage that the fascists cannot match, by our workers who produce the weapons of victory, by our land itself which has become our ally. He paused, letting the words settle over the crowd, then delivered the line that would be repeated through the war. The enemy is at our gates, but gates can be locked. Not one step back, not 1 inch of sacred soil. The crowd erupted in approval that was partially choreographed but partially genuine. These people had lived with the threat of destruction for months. They were exhausted and frightened and determined simultaneously. Stalin's appearance, his refusal to evacuate, his willingness to stand with them, even if only symbolically, provided the psychological anchor they needed to continue. When the speech ended and Stalin returned to the Kremlin, the crowd dispersed to resume their work with renewed energy that productivity reports would document in the following weeks. The factories continued their relentless production despite bombing that killed workers with depressing regularity. The Krasny Oktyabr steel plant, located in the southern suburbs, had been hit 14 times since October. Each raid killed dozens of workers and damaged equipment. Each time the survivors cleared the debris and resumed operations within hours. The workers were women and teenagers mostly, the men having been conscripted for the front. They operated presses and lathes that were dangerous under ideal conditions and potentially lethal when operated by undertrained workers in freezing temperatures. Industrial accidents killed almost as many as the bombing. The work continued because stopping meant defeat, and defeat meant annihilation. A 19-year-old woman named Katya Sokolova operated a shell press that stamped out 706 mortar artillery rounds at a rate of 200 per shift. She had come from Tula when the factories there were evacuated, leaving her family behind to work in Moscow because someone had to make the shells that would stop the Germans. On December 7th, a Luftwaffe raid penetrated the fighter screen and dropped bombs that hit the factory directly. The roof collapsed, killing 40 workers instantly and trapping dozens more. Katya found herself under a section of roof beam that had fallen at an angle, creating a small pocket of survival surrounded by crushing weight. She lay there for 3 hours while rescue crews dug toward her, listening to the screams of others trapped nearby, the screams that gradually stopped one by one until only silence remained. When they finally pulled her out, her right arm was crushed from elbow to wrist, bones broken in multiple places, bleeding internally. They rushed her to a medical station where a doctor assessed the damage and concluded the arm needed immediate amputation to prevent infection from spreading. She refused. They argued. She remained adamant. "I need both arms to operate the press. Just splint it and send me back." The doctor tried to explain about gangrene and sepsis and death. She cut him off. "My brother is at the front. These shells might save his life. I'm not stopping because I broke my arm." They splinted it and gave her morphine they couldn't spare and sent her back to the factory where she resumed work the next day, operating the press one-handed while the injured arm hung useless at her side. She would lose the arm 3 weeks later when infection forced amputation anyway. But by then she had produced another 12,000 shells. She never learned whether any of them saved her brother. He died at Stalingrad the following year. She survived the war and lived until 1989, working in the same factory with one arm, never regretting her decision, never questioning whether the sacrifice had been worth it. The defense of Moscow rested on such decisions, multiplied across millions of individuals who chose to continue when stopping would have been justified. The anti-tank ditches that ringed the city had been dug by 100,000 civilians working in shifts through December, breaking frozen ground with pickaxes because mechanical equipment had been sent to the front. The work killed dozens from exhaustion and exposure. The survivors kept digging. The ditches stretched for 800 kilometers, 4 meters deep and 5 meters wide, positioned to funnel German armor into prepared kill zones where anti-tank guns waited. When completed, they represented the largest defensive earthworks since Verdun, built entirely by civilian labor in conditions that made such construction seem impossible. The Khimki Bridge, 8 kilometers from the Kremlin, represented the closest German advance to Moscow's center. On December 7th, a reconnaissance battalion from the 3rd Panzer Army, battalion's strength reduced to company size through attrition, reached the bridge and radioed the historic message that they could see the Kremlin domes. It was the high water mark of the German offensive, the moment that should have been triumph, but instead marked the beginning of rout. Major Hans Becker, not to be confused with Unteroffizier Hans Becker, who had been last seen on December 5th, commanded the reconnaissance force. His 200 men had covered 60 kilometers in 3 days, fighting through Soviet resistance that should have stopped them, but somehow didn't, sustained by momentum and the conviction that reaching Moscow would justify the losses. They established defensive positions on the western end of the bridge and waited for reinforcements that never arrived. Behind them, the main force that was supposed to exploit their breakthrough had been stopped by Soviet counterattacks and was fighting for survival rather than advancement. The supply convoy that should have reached them with fuel and ammunition had been destroyed by Soviet aircraft. The relief column that departed on the morning of December 8th made it 5 kilometers before being ambushed and annihilated. By nightfall on December 8th, Becker's force had been isolated for 24 hours, with no resupply and no reinforcement. The Soviet counterattack came at dawn on December 9th, spearheaded by the 16th Army under General Konstantin Rokossovsky. 50 T-34 tanks crossed the frozen ground east of the bridge, supported by rifle companies that advanced behind the armor, using the tanks as mobile cover. The German reconnaissance force had 3 PAK-36 anti-tank guns, whose 37mm shells bounced off T-34 armor like thrown stones. They had personal weapons and 2 days of ammunition. They had nowhere to retreat and no prospect of survival. The battle lasted 45 minutes. The T-34s drove directly through German positions, crushing defensive works under their treads, firing high explosive rounds into buildings where Germans had taken cover. The supporting infantry finished what the tanks started, clearing rooms with grenades and automatic weapons. The Germans fought with desperation that accomplished nothing except marginally higher Soviet casualties. When the position finally fell, 18 Germans were taken prisoner from a force of 200. The rest died defending ground they should never have reached, ground they could never have held, ground that represented not achievement, but the final spasm of an offensive that had already failed. The symbolic importance of Khimki exceeded its tactical value. When Soviet propaganda announced that German forces had been thrown back from the gates of Moscow, the claim was technically accurate. When Stalin reviewed reports showing the closest German approach had been repulsed, he allowed himself a rare moment of satisfaction. The capital had held. The enemy had reached within sight of victory and been turned back. The psychological impact reverberated through both armies. Soviet soldiers who had retreated for 6 months felt the exhilaration of advance. German soldiers who had never known defeat felt the hollow terror of unstoppable retreat. The German command structure began fragmenting under the strain. Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, commanding Army Group Center, requested permission on December 12th to conduct a strategic withdrawal to defensible winter positions 150 kilometers west of Moscow. The request reached Hitler's headquarters and was denied within hours. No retreat, not one step back. The positions would be held regardless of cost. Officers who disagreed could be replaced. Von Bock, who had commanded armies since before Hitler came to power, found himself overruled by a former corporal whose strategic understanding came from ideological certainty rather than military training. On December 16th, Hitler issued Directive 39, which codified his refusal to accept reality into operational orders. Every position would be held fanatically. Retreats without Hitler's personal authorization would result in immediate court-martial and execution. Commanders who failed would be relieved and tried for defeatism. The order came from a man sitting in a heated headquarters 800 kilometers from the front, a man who had never experienced -40 Celsius, or watched his equipment freeze, or buried men who died from cold rather than combat. Feldwebel Otto Meissner received the order on December 17th through a runner who had walked 30 kilometers through blizzard conditions to deliver it. He read it twice, his weathered face showing no expression, then gathered his squad around a small fire they had built from furniture torn from a destroyed house. New orders from Berlin. We hold this position. No retreat authorized. Anyone who withdraws will be shot. The men absorbed this information with the dull acceptance of those too exhausted to protest. One of them, a private from Leipzig who couldn't have been more than 20, asked the obvious question. Does Berlin know we're dying out here? Meissner folded the order and tucked it inside his jacket where body heat would keep it from freezing solid. Berlin knows. Berlin doesn't care. To them, we're symbols on a map. They don't see the frostbite. They don't smell the gangrene. They don't hear the screams at night. They just see lines that need to stay where they are. Another soldier, this one a veteran who had been with Meissner since Poland, voiced what they were all thinking. So what do we do? Meissner stared into the fire, watching flames consume wood that had been someone's table or chair in another life. He had survived the Western Front by understanding when orders made sense and when they amounted to suicide disguised as duty. He had 30 years of military service and no illusions about what happened to soldiers caught between impossible orders and certain death. We hold as long as we can. Then we retreat anyway and hope we reach our own lines before the cold or the Russians get us. And we never speak of having retreated. We'll say we conducted a tactical withdrawal to prepared positions. We'll call it anything except retreat. And if they court-martial us, at least we'll be in a warm jail cell. The grim humor drew no laughter, only nods of understanding. They would follow orders until following orders meant death. Then they would do what men had always done when leaders failed them. They would try to survive. The frozen army that Soviet scouts discovered on December 20th existed in a state between life and death, organization and chaos. Patrols moving through forests west of Klin found German positions that showed no resistance because everyone in them had died, not from combat, not from violence of any kind. Simply from cold so extreme, It had overwhelmed the body's capacity to generate heat faster than the environment stole it. A Soviet reconnaissance company commanded by a captain whose name didn't survive the war came upon a German defensive line that should have been manned by 200 men. They approached cautiously, expecting fire, receiving only silence. When they entered the position, they found the soldiers at their posts, rifles ready, eyes open, completely frozen. Some stood upright, some knelt behind machine guns, some sat in foxholes with grenades in hand. All of them dead, all of them in position, all of them transformed into ice statues by a night when the temperature had dropped to -42, and they had lacked the shelter or heat source or physical reserves to survive it. The scene repeated across the front as Soviet forces advanced through German positions. Entire companies discovered frozen at their posts. Supply columns found with drivers still in their seats, hands on steering wheels, faces turned toward destinations they never reached. Artillery batteries where crews had frozen while trying to service their guns. The Wehrmacht, which had prided itself on discipline and order, had been reduced to a death tableau. Soldiers who had followed orders so completely they remained at their posts even as those posts became their tombs. The psychological impact on Soviet soldiers who witnessed these scenes carried its own weight. Private Ivan Sokolov, a 20-year-old from a collective farm near Kursk, wrote in a letter home that was intercepted by military censors and never delivered. "We found them today, the fascists who came to enslave us. They were frozen like the statues in Moscow parks. I felt pity, which surprised me. Then I remembered what they did to my village and the pity went away. But I can't forget their eyes. They were open. They saw death coming and couldn't stop it. I wonder if that's how our soldiers looked when they froze last winter." War makes monsters of all of us. By December 25th, the Soviet offensive had pushed German forces back between 150 and 250 kilometers on a 600-kilometer front. Army Group Center had suffered 255,000 casualties, lost 1,500 tanks either destroyed or abandoned, and had its combat effectiveness reduced to a fraction of June levels. The dream of taking Moscow had transformed into the nightmare of surviving winter. The vaunted Wehrmacht that had crushed Poland in weeks and France in days found itself in full retreat before an enemy it had dismissed as racially inferior and strategically incompetent. The night of December 25th brought no Christmas peace. Soviet forces continued attacking through darkness, maintaining pressure that prevented German units from establishing defensive lines. The pursuit was relentless, calculated to prevent the enemy from consolidating, to keep them moving through cold that killed as efficiently as bullets. Casualties mounted on both sides, but the mathematics favored the Soviets. They could afford to trade lives for territory. Germany, fighting on multiple fronts with finite resources, could not. In his bunker beneath the Kremlin, Stalin received reports from Zhukov detailing the offensive's success. He listened without interruption, smoking his pipe, face showing no emotion as casualty figures were read. Soviet losses for December totaled 380,000 killed, wounded, or missing. German losses were estimated at over 400,000 when cold-related casualties were included. The arithmetic was brutal but favorable. When Zhukov finished, Stalin removed the pipe and used it to gesture at the map showing the new front lines. "How long can they continue retreating? They'll try to establish winter defensive lines, Comrade Stalin, but they lack the equipment and supplies to hold indefinitely. If we maintain pressure through January, they'll be forced to withdraw further." Stalin nodded slowly, calculations running behind those cold eyes. "Continue the offensive, no rest, no consolidation. Drive them west until they break completely." The order condemned tens of thousands more Soviet soldiers to death from combat and cold, but it also ensured that Germany's defeat, when it came, would be absolute rather than negotiated. Stalin understood that wars were won not by brilliant maneuvers, but by attrition, by willingness to accept casualties that would break other nations, by leveraging advantages of geography and population until the enemy's will collapsed under the weight of impossibility. The year 1941 ended with Army Group Center in full retreat, Moscow saved, and the myth of Wehrmacht invincibility shattered beyond repair. The battle was not over, but its outcome had been determined by cold and logistics and the refusal of the Soviet people to accept defeat. What came next would be 3 more years of grinding warfare, battles that would make Moscow seem almost insignificant by comparison. But the turning point had been reached. Germany had lost the war on December 5th when the temperature dropped below -35, and Soviet artillery announced that Russia had stopped retreating and started advancing. The Kalinin Highway on December 22nd had transformed into a corridor of the damned. What remained of Army Group Center's northern wing streamed westward in a procession that bore no resemblance to military withdrawal. This was route disguised as retreat, 40,000 men moving through waist-deep snow with the desperation of animals fleeing wildfire. The road itself had ceased to exist as a functional transportation route. Abandoned vehicles lined both sides, hulks of trucks and half-tracks that had run out of fuel or suffered mechanical failure or simply stopped when their drivers died. The soldiers walked between these monuments to broken logistics, their faces hidden behind improvised scarves, their eyes reflecting nothing but the white expanse ahead and the certain knowledge that most would not reach safety. They moved in small clusters rather than organized units, discipline having dissolved under the combined assault of cold, hunger, and terror. Officers who tried to maintain command structure found their authority ignored or openly defied. The threat of court-martial meant nothing to men who expected to freeze before any tribunal could convene. Some officers abandoned their ranks, tearing off insignia to blend with enlisted men in the hope that anonymity might provide protection from Soviet patrols targeting leadership. Others simply walked, no longer issuing orders, their authority having evaporated along with the infrastructure that had made authority meaningful. The wounded presented an impossible calculus. Men with shrapnel wounds or bullet injuries that would have been survivable with medical treatment died within hours in -38-degree temperatures. Those who could walk continued despite injuries that left blood trails in the snow. Those who could not walk faced abandonment by companions too exhausted to carry extra weight. The medics had run out of supplies days earlier. Bandages froze solid against wounds. Morphine, when it existed at all, came in ampules that shattered if not kept close to body heat. The standard protocol became triage by mobility, a brutal equation where inability to keep pace meant death from exposure or Soviet action. A Hauptmann whose name survives only in Soviet interrogation records made a decision on that road that would haunt him through 5 years of captivity and 40 years of subsequent life. His company, reduced to 37 men from 160, included 12 wounded who could no longer march. He had neither transport nor bearers. The temperature stood at -40 and dropping as evening approached. He could leave the wounded to freeze, which would happen within hours. He could try to carry them, which would slow the column and doom everyone. Or he could provide what mercy the situation allowed. He distributed the last of his pistol ammunition to the wounded, 1 round per man. No explanations were needed. They understood. Some accepted without protest, beyond caring whether death came from cold or bullet. Others wept, begging not to be left. 2 refused the ammunition and insisted on attempting to walk, managing perhaps 200 meters before collapsing in the snow where they remained motionless as the column passed them by. The Hauptmann shot the remaining 10 himself, 1 bullet each to the head. Executions performed with the mechanical efficiency of a man who had detached from the moral implications of his actions, because contemplating them would have led to paralysis. When finished, he dropped the empty pistol in the snow and walked on, his expression never changing. Soviet forces found the bodies 3 days later, arrangement and wounds making the circumstances obvious. The Hauptmann survived the war, returned to Germany in 1950, worked as an accountant in Hamburg, and hanged himself in his office in 1963 without leaving a note. His wife told investigators he had never spoken about Russia except once, when drunk, mentioning something about mercy that had really been murder. Behind the retreating columns, Soviet cavalry and ski troops pursued with the efficiency of wolves culling a herd. They were not attempting to engage in set-piece battles, but rather to maintain pressure that prevented the Germans from establishing defensive positions. Small unit actions became the norm. A Soviet squad would appear from tree cover, engage German stragglers with automatic weapons fire, then disappear before return fire could be organized. Partisan groups, local Russians armed with captured weapons and burning with desire for revenge, attacked supply columns and isolated groups with particular savagery. The rules of warfare, never firmly established on the Eastern Front, dissolved completely into a struggle where both sides understood that prisoners were liabilities neither could afford. The horses that had survived this long died in the final stretch, their bodies creating macabre waypoints along the retreat route. These animals, which had hauled artillery and supplies across Europe, fell in their traces when their bodies finally consumed the last reserves of energy. Soldiers paused only long enough to hack meat from the carcasses, carving chunks from animals whose eyes still held the dimming spark of life. The meat was consumed raw because stopping to build fires meant capture or death from cold. It provided minimal nutrition, barely enough to fuel another few kilometers of movement, but men ate it anyway because hunger overrode revulsion. The Volokholamsk Road, running southwest from the Moscow positions, witnessed similar scenes played out across 25,000 retreating soldiers and the remnants of 3 panzer divisions. The tanks, those steel predators that had terrorized Europe, now served as shelters for freezing infantry who huddled against engine blocks that retained trace warmth even after fuel exhaustion had immobilized them. Crews abandoned their vehicles when the last drops of diesel were consumed, taking only personal weapons and whatever food remained, leaving millions of Reichsmarks worth of equipment to rust in snowbanks. Soviet recovery teams would spend months salvaging these abandoned machines, studying German engineering, learning lessons that would inform their own tank development. The psychological landscape of defeat proved as devastating as the physical one. German soldiers who had internalized propaganda about Slavic inferiority found themselves beaten by an enemy they had been taught to despise. The cognitive dissonance created either rage or resignation. Some blamed Hitler for sending them unprepared into winter. Others blamed their commanders for tactical failures. A few blamed themselves for insufficient willpower. Most simply stopped thinking beyond the next step, the next breath, the next moment of continued existence. Lieutenant Dmitry Volkov, the 23-year-old Siberian officer whose division had spearheaded the December 6th assault, now led his platoon in pursuit operations that required covering 20 kilometers daily through terrain the Germans had already stripped of resources. His men were exhausted despite superior equipment and training. The offensive that had seemed triumphant in its opening days had evolved into a grinding advance where every kilometer gained cost, blood, and exposure. On December 26, his platoon came upon a German field hospital that had been abandoned with patients still inside. The building had been a collective farm administration center, brick construction, with a tile roof that had partially collapsed from bombardment. Inside, Soviet soldiers found 47 German wounded, some with bandages, most without, all of them suffering from combinations of combat injuries and frostbite. The men lay on the floor or leaned against walls, their faces showing the resignation of those who had expected death and received only delayed execution. Medical supplies were completely absent. The last doctor had departed 2 days earlier, leaving only a note explaining that he could not save them and would not watch them die. Volkov's orders were clear. Wounded prisoners were to be sent to rear area collection points for interrogation and eventual transfer to POW camps. The reality was that his platoon had no transport, no medical supplies, and orders to maintain pursuit of retreating forces. Taking 47 wounded prisoners would require bearers, slow the advance, and provide no tactical benefit. Leaving them to freeze was legally and morally problematic, but practically inevitable. He stood in the doorway of that building for 5 full minutes, visible breath hanging in clouds, wrestling with a decision that had no correct answer. His political officer, a NKVD lieutenant named Grigory Petrov, whose job was ensuring ideological compliance, solved the dilemma by removing it from Volkov's hands. These are fascist invaders who came to enslave our people. They showed no mercy to our wounded. We are not obligated to show mercy to theirs. Volkov found his voice tight when he responded. They're wounded and helpless. Leaving them here is a death sentence. Petrov's face remained impassive, the expression of a man for whom ideological certainty provided immunity from moral complexity. Then it is a sentence they earned by invading the motherland. We have orders to pursue. We will pursue. The platoon departed, leaving the wounded Germans to their fate. None survived. Soviet graves registration units found the bodies in January, frozen in the positions they had occupied when life departed, their final moments unrecorded but easily imagined. Volkov would carry the memory for 46 years until his death in 1988, one of dozens of similar decisions that accumulated weight until breathing itself felt like dragging lead. He never spoke of it except in a journal he kept hidden until his widow burned it after his death, unable to bear reading about the things her husband had witnessed and done. The cost of Soviet victory in human terms had been carefully concealed behind propaganda celebrating the defense of Moscow. The casualty figures released to the public spoke of German losses while minimizing Soviet ones. The reality was starker and more troubling. Between December 1st and January 7th, Soviet forces suffered 380,000 casualties, 120,000 killed, 260,000 wounded or suffering from frostbite severe enough to require medical evacuation. The numbers exceeded German losses for the same period, a fact that Soviet planners understood but could not publicly acknowledge. The mathematics of attrition warfare favored the Soviet Union not because Soviet soldiers were more expendable, but because the population base and industrial capacity could sustain casualty rates that would have crippled Germany. The Wehrmacht had entered Russia with 3 million men, and by December had lost nearly 800,000 killed, wounded, or captured. Replacements were coming slowly and with inadequate training. The Soviet Union had lost over 3 million men by December, but continued fielding armies because mobilization reached deeper into society, because factory production continued despite evacuation and bombing, because the alternative to bleeding was extinction. The German prisoners taken during the counteroffensive numbered 35,000 by the end of December, a figure that would swell to over 90,000 by February as encircled units surrendered. Their survival rate told its own story. The Soviet POW system, already strained by millions of prisoners, lacked capacity to house, feed, or provide medical care for tens of thousands more arrivals. The camps were improvised affairs, barbed wire enclosures in open fields where prisoners huddled in whatever shelter they could construct from available materials. Food came irregularly in quantities calculated to keep prisoners barely alive. Medical care was non-existent, except for interrogation subjects whose information justified the morphine and bandages required to keep them communicating. A column of 2,400 German prisoners, captured near Klin on December 15, began a march to rear area camps on December 17. The march covered 150 kilometers through territory where Soviet logistics barely functioned, and German prisoners rated last priority for resources. They walked in their summer uniforms, wounded and healthy mixed together because Soviet guards lacked means to separate them, following roads that were barely marked. Guards were NKVD troops with orders to shoot anyone who fell behind or attempted escape. The guards themselves were cold and hungry, their patience non-existent, their willingness to interpret orders broadly demonstrated repeatedly. The first day, 60 prisoners died or were shot attempting to shelter. The second day, 130. By the fourth day, the column had fragmented into clusters of men who could no longer maintain pace, and the guards simply shot stragglers rather than waste time dragging them forward. 900 prisoners reached the camp alive. 700 survived their first month. By war's end in 1945, 800 of the original 2,400 would be alive to be repatriated. The 66% mortality rate was typical rather than exceptional. The Soviet POW system grinding up prisoners through combination of malnutrition, disease, exposure, and institutional indifference. The moral complexity of this carnage defied simple narrative. The Germans had invaded with explicit intent to enslave or exterminate Soviet populations. Their treatment of Soviet prisoners was demonstrably worse, with mortality rates exceeding 80%. The Soviet response to captured Germans was brutal but not exterminatory, born of logistical collapse rather than genocidal policy. Yet the suffering was real, the deaths were preventable, and the violation of basic human dignity was absolute regardless of which side bore greater guilt for initiating the horror. In Moscow, the Kremlin's underground command complex buzzed with activity that felt almost celebratory despite the ongoing battle. Maps showed German forces pushed back from the capital, salients eliminated, territorial gains measured in hundreds of kilometers. On January 7th, Stalin summoned Zhukov and senior commanders to assess the offensive's outcome and plan next operations. The room was heavy with pipe smoke and the tension of men who had narrowly avoided catastrophe and now contemplated their next moves. Zhukov presented the operational summary with characteristic bluntness, knowing that Stalin valued accuracy over optimism when making strategic decisions. He stood before the large wall map, pointer in hand, indicating German positions with the precision of a surgeon describing pathology. Enemy forces have retreated between 150 and 250 kilometers on a 600-kilometer front. Army Group Center's combat effectiveness is estimated at 30% of June levels. They have lost 1,500 tanks, 2,500 artillery pieces, and approximately 255,000 casualties, including killed, wounded, missing, and captured. Stalin listened without interruption, face impassive, pipe clenched between teeth. When Zhukov paused, the general secretary removed the pipe and used it to gesture at the map. Our losses? The question hung in the air like cordite smoke. Zhukov had prepared for it, but delivery still required effort. These were not abstract numbers, but Soviet citizens, soldiers who had trusted their commanders to use their lives purposefully. The weight of command rested in the statistical precision required to quantify human cost. 380,000 casualties, Comrade Stalin, 120,000 killed in action, 260,000 wounded or frostbite cases requiring evacuation. The silence stretched. Stalin's expression remained unchanged, but his eyes performed calculations that Zhukov could almost see occurring behind them. The arithmetic of total war required balancing blood against strategic objectives, accepting losses that would have been unthinkable in limited conflicts. They can afford such losses? The question was rhetorical, but Zhukov answered anyway. No, Comrade Stalin. German reinforcement capacity cannot replace these losses. Their industrial base lacks depth. Their population is fully mobilized with no additional reserves. We estimate they can sustain current casualty rates for perhaps 6 more months before offensive capability is permanently degraded. Stalin nodded slowly, the gesture conveying satisfaction rather than sentiment. He stood and approached the map, studying the disposition of forces with the intensity of a man whose survival depended on accurate assessment. His finger traced the new front lines, pausing at key positions. And we can afford our losses? This question was not rhetorical. It demanded honest appraisal of Soviet capacity to sustain operations that consumed men at rates exceeding replacement. Zhukov chose his words carefully, balancing truth with the understanding that excessive pessimism invited accusations of defeatism. We can sustain current losses for 12 to 18 months given our population base and production capacity. The factories in the Urals are producing sufficient equipment. Conscription is reaching deeper into eligible populations. We have strategic depth the Germans lack. Stalin returned to his chair, relit his pipe, and delivered the judgment that would define Soviet strategy for the next year. Then we continue. The fascists believed winter would stop us as it stopped them. They were wrong. We attack through winter, through spring, through summer. We attack until they break completely. This is no longer a war of maneuver. It is a war of attrition, and in wars of attrition, Russia does not lose. The statement carried the force of doctrine, transforming strategic assessment into operational orders. Soviet forces would maintain offensive pressure regardless of cost, accepting casualties that would horrify Western allies but which Soviet leadership deemed acceptable given the existential nature of the conflict. The Great Patriotic War would become a grinding attritional struggle, consuming 27 million Soviet lives before victory, a price paid willingly by leadership, if not always by those whose blood purchased it. The strategic implications of Moscow's defense rippled outward across the global conflict. In Tokyo, Japanese military planners reviewed intelligence reports about German defeat and drew conclusions that would reshape Pacific strategy. The Kwantung Army had prepared plans for attacking Soviet Siberia, betting that German victory would make such an attack feasible. German failure meant those plans were shelved, Japan's focus shifting entirely to Southeast Asia, in eventual confrontation with the United States. The decision not to attack the USSR freed Soviet Siberian divisions for transfer west, reinforcements that had proven crucial in December's counteroffensive. In London, Winston Churchill received reports of Moscow's survival with relief bordering on euphoria. Britain had stood alone against Germany for 18 months, surviving the Blitz through determination and American material support. Soviet survival meant Germany faced a two-front war, the nightmare scenario that German planners had sought to avoid through rapid victory in the East. Churchill immediately authorized increased aid to the Soviet Union, despite his visceral anti-communism, understanding that anyone fighting Hitler deserved support regardless of ideological differences. In Washington, the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7th had brought America into the war, but strategic planning still centered on Europe. Reports of German defeat at Moscow confirmed that the Soviet Union would remain in the war, justifying American strategy of Germany first, despite pressure to prioritize the Pacific. The alliance between capitalist democracies and communist dictatorship was marriage of convenience, not ideology. But Moscow's survival made that marriage strategically viable. The battlefield itself told stories that strategic assessments could not capture. In February, when partial thaw began, the snow that had hidden bodies revealed the true cost. Soviet graves registration units moved across the former battlefields, cataloging dead from both sides. The numbers defied comprehension. In forests west of Moscow, they found German companies frozen in defensive positions, entire units killed by cold rather than combat. Near Klin, a mass grave contained 3,000 Soviet soldiers killed in the offensive's opening days. The Kalinin Highway showed evidence of the retreat's horror, bodies every few hundred meters for 30 kilometers, some clearly executed, others dead from exposure or wounds. The work of identification and burial continued through spring, each body representing someone's son or father or husband. The Germans had no mechanism for recovering their dead, Soviet control of the battlefield, meaning most would remain where they fell until local authorities buried them in mass graves. The Soviets attempted identification when possible, recovering documents and personal effects that might provide closure to families. The scale overwhelmed the system. By March, Soviet authorities acknowledged that tens of thousands of bodies would never be identified, their graves marked simply unknown Soviet soldier or left unmarked entirely. Feldwebel Otto Meissner reached German lines on January 3rd after 11 days of retreat through conditions that killed three-quarters of his original company. He arrived with both feet requiring amputation from gangrene, having lost 40 kilograms from his pre-campaign weight, blind in his left eye from frostbite damage to the optic nerve. The field hospital where he was evacuated was overwhelmed with cases presenting similar injuries. Doctors performed triage based not on severity, but on likelihood of return to combat effectiveness. Meissner's age, 42, and injuries meant he would never fight again. They amputated his feet at mid-ankle. The procedure performed with minimal anesthesia because morphine reserves had been exhausted days earlier. He survived, evacuated by hospital train to Germany, where recovery consumed 6 months in a facility that was filling with casualties from an Eastern Front that showed no signs of stabilizing. The Gestapo interviewed him about his retreat, asking pointed questions about whether he had obeyed Hitler's no-retreat order. He lied smoothly, claiming he had followed orders precisely and withdrawn only when his position was overrun. The interviewer seemed skeptical but lacked evidence for court-martial. Meissner was discharged with a pension and sent home to Hamburg, where he would spend the remainder of the war working in a munitions factory, his mechanical expertise making him valuable despite his disabilities. He survived until 1967, long enough to see Germany rebuilt and divided, long enough to watch children who had never known war grow into adults. He never spoke publicly about Russia except to say he had been there, declining all requests for details. In private, in a journal discovered after his death, he wrote about the campaign with brutal honesty. December 1941, "We marched to Moscow believing we were invincible. We marched back believing nothing. I saw things no man should see. Friends eating horse meat raw, men shooting each other over scraps, entire companies frozen like statues. The cold was not our enemy. Our pride was our enemy. We believed we could conquer Russia in one summer. Russia taught us that belief is not strategy. By the time we learned the lesson, 40,000 of us were dead and the rest were crippled. I lost my feet. Others lost more. Some lost their humanity." I came home, but the boy who marched into Russia in June never returned. He froze somewhere east of Moscow and was never buried. The entries continued for pages, documenting not glory, but degradation, not heroism, but survival, not victory, but the hollow achievement of remaining alive when death had been the likelier outcome. His widow burned the journal after his death, unable to reconcile the broken man she had known with the idealistic soldier who had departed in 1941. She kept only one page, the final entry, which she reread periodically until her own death in 1983. Was it worth it? We were told we fought for Germany, for the Führer, for civilization against barbarism. What we actually fought for was survival. The war killed millions and achieved nothing except switching which tyrant ruled which territory. The boys who froze in Russian forests died for a madman's dream that was doomed before it started. I survived. I don't know if that makes me lucky or cursed. The dead are at peace. I still hear them screaming. The spring of 1942 brought no peace, only strategic repositioning. The Soviet winter offensive continued into March, pushing German forces back from Moscow, but failing to achieve the encirclement and destruction that Stalin demanded. The front stabilized not through German defensive success, but through Soviet exhaustion, offensive operations consuming men and material faster than they could be replaced. By April, both sides were too depleted for major operations, using the mud of spring thaw to recover and rebuild. The anniversary of the battle's conclusion passed unmarked on the actual battlefield, but commemorated extensively in Moscow and Berlin, each side crafting narratives that served political needs. Soviet propaganda celebrated the defense of Moscow as proof of socialist superiority, the triumph of the Soviet system over fascist aggression. German propaganda acknowledged tactical setbacks while promising ultimate victory, blaming winter and logistics while avoiding mention of strategic failure. Both narratives contained elements of truth wrapped in layers of manipulation. The veterans who survived carried their own truths, more complex and disturbing than official histories acknowledge. A German survivor, interviewed in 1975 for a university oral history project, spoke with the exhausted honesty of someone too old to maintain pretense. People ask if I was a hero. I say no. Heroes don't run. Heroes don't leave wounded friends to freeze. Heroes don't steal food from dead men's pockets. I was a coward who survived by doing whatever it took. The cold stripped away everything we pretended to be and showed us what we actually were, which was animals trying not to die. The Russians were the same. Everyone was the same. War doesn't bring out the best in people. It brings out desperation. The only difference between us and them was they were defending their homes while we were trying to steal those homes. That's not heroism. That's home invasion that went wrong. Soviet veterans spoke less openly due to state censorship and cultural pressure to maintain the myth of unified patriotic resistance. Private conversations recorded surreptitiously by Western journalists or captured in samizdat literature revealed similar complexity. A tank commander who fought at Klin wrote in unpublished memoirs that circulated in manuscript form during the 1970s. We were told we fought for Mother Russia, for Stalin, for communism. What we actually fought for was avoiding NKVD bullets for retreat and avoiding German bullets for defending. We won because we had more bullets to avoid. Also because Germans froze and we didn't, mostly. The propaganda says we were fearless heroes. Really, we were terrified children in men's bodies doing terrible things to survive. I killed maybe 40 Germans, maybe more. I don't remember most of their faces. They blur together into one enemy who probably had mothers and wives and didn't want to be there either. War is not glorious. War is two groups of young men killing each other for old men's delusions. The lessons of Moscow reverberated through military academies and strategic planning offices for decades. The tactical conclusions were obvious. Never underestimate an opponent. Never extend supply lines beyond logistical capacity. Never assume political will can overcome material reality. The strategic conclusions proved more elusive. Germany's defeat at Moscow did not end the war immediately, but made eventual German defeat inevitable by transforming quick victory into attritional struggle that Germany could not win. The human lessons resisted codification. Cold kills without ideology. Logistics matters more than courage. Supply chains determine outcomes more reliably than tactical brilliance. Pride is more dangerous than any weapon an enemy can deploy. These truths seemed obvious in retrospect, but had been invisible to planners who began Barbarossa with confidence that willpower would overcome material constraints. In 1965, 24 years after the battle, the Soviet Union erected a monument at Khimki, the point of closest German approach to Moscow. The monument was simple, a steel anti-tank barrier marking the spot where the 16th Army had stopped the reconnaissance battalion that could see the Kremlin. Inscriptions celebrated Soviet heroism without mentioning the cost. Victory without acknowledging the mountains of dead that purchased it. Veterans attended the dedication, old men in uniforms covered with medals, standing at attention while speeches praised their sacrifice. Among them was Lieutenant Dmitry Volkov, now 67, face carved with lines that spoke of memories he wished he could forget. He stood silently during the speeches, thoughts elsewhere, remembering not glory but the abandoned German hospital and 47 wounded men he had left to freeze because orders and ideology and exhaustion had eliminated every other option. The monument claimed to honor heroes. He knew it really commemorated survivors, men who had done what was necessary, regardless of whether necessary meant noble. The German survivors had no monuments on that battlefield, their dead lying in mass graves or scattered individually across forests and fields where Soviet authorities had never bothered with recovery. In Germany, memorials were complicated by national shame and the difficulty of honoring soldiers who had fought for a regime whose crimes rendered conventional military commemoration problematic. The dead of the Eastern Front existed in a liminal space, neither celebrated as heroes nor condemned as criminals, but simply acknowledged as men who had died far from home in service of evil. The legacy of that winter extended beyond military history into cultural memory and national identity. For the Soviet Union, later Russia, the defense of Moscow became foundational myth, evidence of national resilience, and proof that the motherland could withstand any assault. The narrative emphasized Russian strength while minimizing Soviet casualties and ignoring uncomfortable truths about the regime's own brutality. For Germany, the defeat at Moscow marked the beginning of the end, the point where victory ceased being possible and survival became the only objective. The narrative emphasized the tragedy of German soldiers betrayed by leadership rather than confronting complicity in genocidal war. The cold itself became metaphorical, representing forces beyond human control, natural limits on ambition, the universe's indifference to ideological certainty. Poets and novelists mined the battle for imagery about humanity struggling against implacable opposition. Politicians invoked it as warning against hubris or promised that resistance could overcome overwhelming odds. Historians analyzed logistics and tactics while trying to comprehend the human experience of fighting in minus 40 degrees while starving and watching friends freeze. The final accounting was written not in casualty statistics, but in the lives permanently altered by those winter months. The Wehrmacht soldier who lost his feet and returned to find his fiancée had married someone else. The Soviet factory worker who lost her arm and spent 50 years operating machinery with her remaining hand. The tank commander who survived the war but died of alcoholism at 45, using vodka to silence memories that gave him no peace. The German officer who shot his wounded men and later hanged himself. The Soviet lieutenant who abandoned German prisoners and carried guilt until death. These were the true costs, measured not in territory gained or strategic objectives achieved, but in shattered lives and permanent trauma. The battle statistics suggested a Soviet victory, German defeat, historical turning point. The human reality was more complex and more universal, a demonstration of what humans become when civilization's thin veneer is stripped away by cold and hunger and violence, revealing the desperate animal beneath. In the 21st century, researchers with metal detectors and GPR equipment still find bodies in forests around Moscow, German and Soviet alike, frozen into soil that preserves them with macabre fidelity. Each discovery prompts brief news coverage, DNA testing if remains, permit identification, and eventual burial in cemeteries maintained by governments that view the battle as distant history rather than lived experience. The men who fought have nearly all died, taking their memories with them, leaving only documents and official histories that cannot fully capture what occurred. The winter still comes every year to the Russian steppes, temperature still drops to -40, snow still covers everything in white. The land remembers nothing being land, but the human pattern of invasion and defeat and retreat has been repeated enough times across Russian history that each new winter feels like echo of previous winters. Endless cycle of armies marching east with confidence and retreating west with devastation. The lesson seems obvious, yet requires relearning by each generation that believes itself exempt from historical patterns. The final meditation belongs not to historians or generals, but to the weather itself, that neutral force that killed Germans and Soviets equally without ideology or preference. Winter cares nothing for politics or morality. It simply exists, following thermodynamic laws that trump human will, regardless of how fiercely that will burns. The Wehrmacht learned that cold cannot be conquered by determination. The Red Army learned that winning in winter means accepting casualties that summer armies would deem intolerable. Both lessons were purchased in blood and frozen flesh across a front stretching from Leningrad to the Black Sea. The Battle of Moscow ended in early January 1942 with German forces pushed back, Soviet forces too exhausted to pursue further, and winter continuing its indifferent reign over landscapes now empty of major combat. The soldiers who survived returned to new campaigns, new battles, new horrors. The soldiers who died remained where they fell, frozen monuments to a struggle that destroyed them, regardless of which side they fought for. The cold receded with spring's arrival, revealing the devastation it had concealed, then returned the following winter to begin the cycle again. History records that Germany lost the Battle of Moscow and consequently lost the war. The historical record is accurate but incomplete. Germany lost because it underestimated its enemy, overextended its logistics, and believed ideological certainty could overcome material reality. The Soviet Union won because it absorbed casualties that would have broken other nations, because its industrial base survived despite catastrophic losses, and because its leadership was willing to sacrifice millions to avoid extinction. Neither side emerged from that winter unchanged. Both learned that modern war consumed nations as thoroughly as it consumed individuals, that technology and firepower meant nothing when supply chains collapsed, and that winter was not a season to be endured, but a weapon to be feared. The monument at Khimki still stands, steel and concrete testimony to the day German advance stopped 8 kilometers from the Kremlin. Around it, the forest has grown back, covering the scars of battle, concealing the frozen dead beneath layers of soil and vegetation. Each winter, snow falls again, covering the monument, covering the land, covering the memories that refuse to stay buried. In that endless white past and present blur together, and somewhere in the howling wind between the trees, you can still hear them if you listen carefully enough. The men who marched toward Moscow, believing in victory. The men who retreated, believing in nothing. The men who froze in place, believing death was preferable to another step through snow. They are all still there, preserved in the collective memory of a battle that proved empires cannot conquer winters, that pride cannot defeat logistics, that sometimes the strongest weapon is simply the will to survive when every force in the universe is working toward your destruction. The cold was patient then. The cold is patient now. And in the silence between snowflakes, the lesson echoes across decades, waiting for the next leader who believes himself exempt from history's judgments. The next army that thinks it can march into winter and emerge victorious. The next generation that must learn what their ancestors knew. That in Russia, winter is not a season but a sentence, not weather but warfare, not an obstacle but an absolute verdict that accepts no appeals and offers no mercy to those who fail to respect it.